Welcome. My name is Amy Jean Nickoloff, and this is episode 3 of Mother's Writ and Wisdom. Last week in episode 2, I talked about art and contemplated whether art can make you a better person. I would argue that it can for many reasons. Not only does art display lessons of what to do and what not to do, art can also be a healthy way of expressing one's emotions and feelings. This week, I want to talk about free will. Do we have free will to choose for ourselves inside the time of space where we reside? Or are we tethered to the oneness as we work as a family to evolve or gestate to the fullness of our capabilities? Are there times when you feel you have pulled more of yourself in and are operating at a higher level of consciousness than other times? I would argue that the answer is yes. This happens during labor prior to birth. The waxing and waning of contractions spreads consciousness out and then pulls it back in. Those moments of feeling fully present and whole can be self-revealing. The question that arises in my mind is, can an individual self-actualize without free will? This leads me to the next chapter of The Kingdom Has Arrived, Volume 1, Foundations. Snippets from a Wild Ride, a prayer, a poem, a prophecy. And if you want to contemplate your own story written in Scripture as you read along and listen, be sure to grab a copy of the book and journal on Amazon. Chapter 4, Never Too Old to Learn. If I could have just one more conversation with my great-grandmother, I would say to her, "You are an inspiration to me and have been my entire life. Even now, 39 years after you left this planet, having blessed it with your presence, I think of all the wonderful gifts you gave me. The words of wisdom, your passion for Scripture, and your beautiful voice singing, 'How Great Thou Art' to me every time I came to visit you. Recently, you inspired me as I reread an old letter you sent me when I was at summer camp one year. It was just before you died. You wrote that you wished you had given me the little basket on your shelf that I had admired the last time I visited you. I realized that even at 93, you were still learning how to live. It gave me hope that at 52, I still have time to get my act together." My great-grandmother, Jenny Lewis, was in her 80s and 90s during my childhood and lived with my grandparents, Foos and Papa. We visited them frequently, and I had an extraordinary bond with Nanny. She seemed to understand me even when I didn't understand myself. She was that person I could sit with and feel calm and at peace. And for me, that was a challenge since I was a very active child with a mind that was continuously going full speed. I remember walking down the hall to Nanny's room, knowing she was going to be sitting in her wicker rocking chair, her long gray hair up in a bun, reading her Bible or doing cross stitch. My grandmother Foos would yell down the hall at me that I didn't have to sit and listen to the same stories again, but I secretly wanted to hear them over and over. Nanny's smile brightened when I walked through the door and jumped up on the edge of her bed after hugging her and reaching down to grab one of her photo albums from the bottom shelf. I would flip open the album and look at the pictures from Nanny's youth. Nanny grew up on a farm in Bellevue, Ohio. The youngest of 8 children, she loved to be outside with the horses, barn cats, dogs, and other animals on the farm. I loved the stories of her horse, Luther, and how he would blow his stomach up so she couldn't get the girth on the saddle tight. One day after Nanny had left the barn and galloped across the field, Luther let the air out of his stomach. The saddle slid under him with her stuck in it. He stood perfectly still so Nanny wouldn't get hurt. Her brother ran from another field to get her safely out from under the horse. Nanny loved that horse and said it was smarter than her brothers. I loved Luther from a distant dimension in time and space, and often wished I could have traveled back in time to go for a ride on him myself. When she was a young girl, Nanny would dress the barn kittens up, put them in her red wagon, and take them to the middle of the field to sit under the big oak tree. She would read the kittens stories and have a picnic with them to pass the summer days. Since she was the youngest child in the family, her father said she was too small for the farm work, so often she ended up playing alone with the animals. How lucky Nanny was to grow up on a beautiful farm where she could play in the barns and open fields with the animals. Notably to me at the time, Nanny's entire being lit up when she talked about the scripture she had written under each of the pictures in her photo albums. She told me how her God was always with her to protect her and tell her how to live. Nanny had great faith and would read the scriptures to me that went with the pictures in the albums of her childhood and young adult life. Because of Nanny's unique relationship and her conversations with God, it seemed to me that her faith was more tangible and sincere than the faith the minister at our church service preached about when he talked about God. I decided at a young age that if there was a God out there for me, I wanted my God to be like Nanny's God. He seemed like a best friend that she could talk freely to and share everything with. When I was 13 and off at summer camp, Nanny died. I never had a chance to say goodbye. My parents thought it would be too hard for me, so they left me to finish out my week at camp. I thought to myself, Nanny has passed. I guess this means she's gone off to be with her God. I'm not so sure about him anymore. Nanny's death was the first time I contemplated how I felt about God. Up to this point, I had accepted what the authority figures in my life had told me about God, but on this day, I decided I was not sure I liked God at all. I don't recall if I shed any tears at the time, but I remember walking back down the hall to her room each time we went to visit Foos and Papa, where I sat on her bed, thumbing through her photo albums and Bible. I would recall her childhood stories and strain to remember her shaky voice singing How Great Thou Art. Be still and know that I am God. Psalm 46:11. Chapter 5. Test the Spirits. The feeling eluded me, the spirit not found, while in my mom and sister the vibration abounds. What am I missing with my logical mind that so many around me seem able to find? I sit curiously on the sidelines, taking it all in, not wanting to let on. I lack the one thing that would let heaven sing. I experiment for years in search of what they found, my emotional sister and intuitive mom. I borrowed a blouse to test a new theory, that the threads my sister adorned might need to be worn. This test was a failure, no glory was found. Sadly, I returned her blouse, yes, a tad torn. Much to my disappointment, a sister now mad was all that I had. So on to the next test, I decided not to rest until I found an experiment that would result in success. I rushed to the pew to the very same space where my mom basked in the aftertaste of the Spirit's embrace. She insisted the Spirit blessed her that day, making the pain of this world fade away. Another failure I found, and sadness resounded. I walked away weary, my eyes slightly teary. I passed by a table where my mom kept her Bible, a new theory to see where the Spirit might be. I opened the Bible my mom had well worn, the pages that spoke to her all now quite torn. I flipped page to page, confounded by the stories, my mind spinning in circles, dissecting allegories. A little girl now confused by the Spirit's odd movements, past me, beside me, but never inside me. I resorted to the pink blankie that I often adorned and rubbed the silky edges as a consoling reward when God's blanket from heaven had clearly ignored me. Not settled with failure, my pink blankie now worn, I continued to search for the spirit inside me to be born, so that one day in the kingdom I would finally be formed. My theories and testing continued for ages and always led me back to the Bible's worn pages. But exhausted by the pursuit with my logical mind, eventually I decided to leave the spirit behind. Now a young woman searching for wealth, sadly I put the book back on the shelf. Testing the spirits. Beloved, do not trust every spirit, but test the spirits to see if they belong to God, because many false prophets have gone out into the world. This is how you can know the Spirit of God. Every spirit that acknowledges Jesus Christ come in the flesh belongs to God, and every spirit that does not acknowledge Jesus Christ does not belong to God. This is the spirit of the Antichrist that, as you heard, is to come, but in fact is already in the world. You belong to God, children, and you have conquered them, for the one who is in you is greater than the one who is in the world. They belong to the world accordingly. Their teachings belong to the world, and the world listens to them. We belong to God, and anyone who knows God listens to us, while anyone who does not belong to God refuses to hear us. This is how we know the spirit of truth and the spirit of deceit. 1 John 4, 1 through 6. Thank you for joining me today for Mother's Writ and Wisdom.